Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Cheaper Than Therapy. Vanessa and I are so excited about today's guest. We have Sasha Cuff with us. Sasha is a relational somatic practitioner who has spent the last 25 years studying trauma and trauma resolution of all types, along with exploring a multitude of healing modalities and cultural perspectives on wellness. Sasha is deeply committed to his own shadow work and helping others in an embodied way, which, Vanessa and I are always excited to dig into some shadow work. So Sasha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
So I think first and foremost, we were talking a little bit before we started recording. I'd love for you to take us more into exactly like what relational somatics is, right? We were just saying for those listening, depending on your region, depending on your country, depending on your background, it's like there's so many titles, I think, in the therapy world that it can almost be a little confusing. So I'd love to hear more about what that is.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. Yeah, thank you. So somatic therapy, the founder of that would be Peter Levine. 15, 20 years ago, he figured out that a lot of people are actually stuck in their biology, and that the psychology is often a symptom of that, and particularly our survival biology. So the fight, flight, and freeze. If there's traumatic events that are unresolved, they can live in our system like a loop that's stuck in time. And, no matter what you think about it, it doesn't necessarily change the way, it doesn't necessarily transform it. So somatic therapy it's a guided mindfulness practice of going into the body and finding and feeling those places where those trauma loops are stuck. And then the modality is about how to process that out of your nervous system. And then the relational part is when you have somatic therapy, trauma resolution, and you add in all the attachment dynamics and the attachment info and an understanding of attachment trauma. And there's a whole new field that I'm talking a lot about that's not many people I haven't heard anywhere, that I would call relational intelligence and relational healing. And it's something that I'm actually teaching in the classes that I teach, is because I would, like, from looking around and working with people, I would say that about 1/3 of their wounding is what I would call relational wounds. And it's not talked much about in like relational intelligence and relational healing and how to actually do that and what that looks like. And that's a whole emergent field that I'm hoping more and more people will begin to understand.
Love that. Also, for those of you listening, if you don't know Peter Levine's work, please research him. He is a magician. If you've never seen him actually work, it's like you watch him and you're like, how? I mean, it's literally like watching a magician. It's wild. Love him.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love that description of somatic therapy as well. And I feel like the way that you broke it down is like, I'm like, yes, absolutely. And I haven't heard it described in that way. How did you come to do this work, Sasha? Will you tell us a little bit about your journey to what you're doing now?
Yeah, it started about 30 years ago with this, when I was about 20. And this, I would call it the seeker, really kicked in. And I was obsessed with who am I? What am I? What's the universe? What's existence? What's God? What's real? What's true? These really kind of deep existential questions. And then, sorting through all of the spiritual marketplace, trying to find answers and finding that most of what's in there is fluff. And, it took a long time to actually get down to what was really helpful on the spiritual path. And I spent probably 15 years trying to get out of my body and out of this world. And, because in Buddhism, the translation is one of the goals is no more human rebirth. So it kind of gives this impression like this is kind of a mistake that we're trying to undo and get out of. And, after 18 years of just plateauing on that, not really getting anywhere, someone said, well, maybe it's not about getting out. Maybe it's about getting in. And there's a Blackfoot teacher around here who has a teaching, and he says, we're not humans having spiritual experiences. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. So like get into this. And as soon as I started moving towards embodiment, that's when the spiritual path took off. And
Love
but it wasn't what I expected. You know, we tend to think of the spiritual path as like love and light and angels and bliss and nirvana or whatever, you know, and it was like pain and suffering and
And
fear
shadow.
and shame and disgust and the shadow and you know, it took me a bit to catch on, like, oh, this is the path. This is my spiritual path took off at that point. Like, oh wow, and then, you know, around the same time, psychedelics therapy started to become a thing. So I started practicing it for myself and going, wow, this can, when you combine shadow work with psychedelics, you know, it can just sort of accelerate the whole process, partly because of the container that you have, like 8 hours of, so you go layer by layer by layer, whereas like, you know, the weekly appointment, you do an hour and a half and then they go away and they come back, you got to kind of start again. And then you know, so you can only really do these little thin layers at a time. Whereas, you know, in an 8-hour session, you can just kind of keep going and going and going and going. And you can really do big, deep chunks that you would never get to even if you did a 20-hour-and-a-half session. So partly the setup of it is really conducive to deep work. The other thing that happened was I had 3 boys. I had 3 kids, and my first son was, we did a home birth and he was stuck for a long time and it took like 3 days to get him. He finally came out naturally, but his head was all anyways, he screamed for the first 2 years of his life. And we tried everything. We took him to, you know, doctors and naturopaths and healers and energy workers and psychics. And, you know, we ate nothing but kale and brown rice and, you know, tried. And the doctor was like, well, it's colic. And I'm like, okay, great, colic, you know, what's the cause of it? Well, we don't actually, it means fussy baby, but we don't actually know the cause. And I'm like, well, what's the point of making up a name that doesn't mean anything? Anyways, so, okay, colic, whatever that means, fussy baby. We don't actually know what causes it or how to treat it, but gripe water, which has alcohol in it, you can, give them alcohol helps.
I mean, you know, giving alcohol helps a lot of things.
But it didn't solve anything. It didn't solve anything. And so when he was about 2 and we were losing our marbles because we weren't sleeping and we were like totally distressed, and I started practicing muscle testing. And so I thought, oh, maybe I can just connect with his system and I'll muscle test and a list. And I made this huge list of every healing modality I could think of. And the only thing that tested positive was cranial sacral. And we took him to someone and he got cranial sacral and it was like, boom, he stopped crying. And she was like, oh, it was birth trauma. And the light went on. And I started practicing muscle testing with it became a job because it worked. And but then I started to see that there was all these people that were coming, some people would really get helped by like, oh, this remedy, this treatment, you know, kind of like a biofeedback way of getting things that would help them, or allergy testing and all these different things. But there was a whole bunch of people that weren't getting better. And so I started trying to look for, you know, what is this? And, you know, I looked at Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and shamanism and psychotherapy and just trying everything to try to kind of get to the bottom of it. And it was about 12 years ago, I worked with this wonderful woman, Mariah Moser, who has a course called Opening to Grace. And she was teaching Peter Levine's work, but she had added the relational part. And then the light went on and it was like, oh my God, it's unresolved trauma and unprocessed emotional charge. That's why people aren't getting better, because we're not processing that. And even talking about it didn't seem to help much. Often it would just stir it up and then they go home feeling worse. And so once I started to learn these trauma resolution skills, then, you know, the therapy took off, my practice got full, and, you know, it took off.
So I feel curious. I mean, so many different modalities in there that I want to ask you about. I feel like you're that seeker that I love to say has spent a lifetime like sampling the Raja and like, oh, a little bit of this and I love it. And I guess if we start with the relational somatic therapy, will you tell us a little, like, tangibly, like if someone were to come and see you, what would the process of that work look like, as opposed to like talk therapy that they might do?
Okay, yeah, good question. It kind of depends on how much access they have to feeling their body. So if there's a lot of relational wounds, people won't won't be able, like as you're talking about that horrific story, how does it feel inside? Oh, and then my friend abandoned me in Thailand, and they just keep going into these like stories about relational wounds, and they can't feel, they can't access the felt sense. So it's really hard to do somatic therapy. So then you need to just spend a lot of time, or however much time, working on the relational healing, because it'll block access to the body, which is, so sometimes people get frustrated with somatic experiencing practitioners because they're, like, oh, how do you feel in your body? And they keep repeating that, and the person can't feel it, and they get, frustrated, and it can cause some tension in the therapeutic alliance and all of that. But if someone, does, or you work long enough and they start to have access to the felt sense, then people can, as they're say telling a story, oh, when I was 5, my mom died, or, okay, well, as you're saying that, what do you feel inside? Right. And they say, oh, I get all tight in here, and I start feeling anxious. And in the therapy that one of the main things I when I teach classes, the first thing that I teach, is navigating safe touch, and in a lot of therapeutic environments, they've just taken that out because, they don't want therapists fondling their clients or clients fondling their therapists. And so it's easier, just take that out, don't have to deal with that. But that there goes 50% of the healing potential of human healing potential.
Totally.
So what I figured out was, okay, how do we navigate safe touch as a way to start? And some people, you can do that in 10 minutes, and some people, I have one woman, like some people have had a lot of boundary violations with sexual abuse or physical abuse, and especially as a man, the idea of me touching them is just, there's no way. And so until we've navigated it, and and I have a couple of clients where it's taken 2 years to be able to touch our tips of our fingers together. And, just because they've been violated since birth, but most people, a session or 2, you can navigate safe touch. And so then when someone starts going into their trauma, you can actually hold them and entrain your nervous system. So now they're not alone, because in trauma, you're always alone and separate. And you've got an extra nervous system to help regulate that dysregulated, if it's anxiety, say, there's a dysregulated part, and like, oh my God, I'm scared. And you're with, okay, we got this together.
I'm here.
And I actually use my system to slowly over, 5 minutes or something, bring their system back down into regulation, which is the same exact thing that humans do with babies. When
co-regulating, right?
Co-regulating, when the baby's distressed, the adult nervous system comes and co-regulates, and then that teaches that infant nervous system how to do it, and so if you didn't get enough of that co-regulation, you may not be able to self-regulate as an adult, because your biology didn't get the inputs and the transmission and the practice that it needed to learn how to do it for itself, so that's
so it's like, I mean, it is talk therapy, but you're also integrating in this process of allowing traumatic memory, traumatic experience to come up and be pinpointed within the physical body, and then be able to be processed and discharged while you are there, creating not only the safe container that we would create obviously as a talk therapist, but also creating the container of safe touch. And providing that as well.
Yeah, because often that's what was missing, and that's where a lot of like developmental trauma comes from, is not being held enough, right? So what I realized that the psychology is mostly a symptom of what's missing in the biology, and if you didn't get enough of those relational and biological inputs as a infant or a child, your animal body is still longing for them, which is where a lot of anxious attachment comes from. It's like, I can't regulate myself because I never learned how, so I need you to regulate me. And of course, that feels very clingy, and if you understand that, that's great. Oh, they're stuck in their their early, developmental trauma, all they need is a hug and to regulate together. All the stories don't really matter, but let's just, regulate.
Yeah. And so what has this last, God, is it almost a year and a half? I don't even know how long we've been in this moment in history. What has your practice looked like throughout the pandemic? I'm always so curious how people who do a lot of, work with actual touch and connecting with their clients physically, like what have you done to navigate this time?
I mean, my practice has been busier than it's ever been.
I mean, I can imagine.
For a number of reasons, partly because of that. And there is a certain amount you can do over Zoom, depending on if you can work on other things that don't need the touch, because people have a plethora of different
needs.
There seems to be no shortage of material to work with. So you just work with the things that don't need as much touch. I have a really bomber immune system, and I've never been afraid of a virus ever. And so there's other people in that same boat that, I say, obviously if you've got symptoms of a sickness, or I do, we're going to cancel the session. But if we're both feeling fine, we're going to do it, because we actually understand how, a little bit more about how the biology works. And there's a lot of confusing ideas out there about transmission and different things. So I've been seeing people all through the pandemic, and no one's gotten sick and no one's gotten transmitted anything, and it's been fine. Yeah.
I'm so curious, where are you located, Sasha? Like in Canada?
I'm located in
Canada.
In Canada.
I was I can tell the Canada. Yeah. I was like, where are you?
Okay, where are you guys?
We're in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. Okay.
Yeah. I just love when I hear a little Canadian in there. I'm like, wait.
Yeah. Okay. You can tell.
Just a smidge.
I live in Caslow, British Columbia.
Nice.
So we're in the same time zone. It's a tiny little town in the mountains of BC, in the sort of southeast of British Columbia, and big lake, big mountains, not many people around. It's a very lovely place to live, and
sounds lovely for the nervous system.
Yes, very, very resourcing. After working with someone with PTSD, I'll go outside and actually lie on the ground and just merge with the trees, and it's my way of releasing, and my whole body will actually twitch and release nervous energy. And
well, I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I just feel curious, as someone who has done so much work around all of these different modalities. Why do you think there are so many potent healers in Canada? I feel like there is something in the water up there.
Oh, really?
Do you have an idea, Sasha? Like, what's going on up there? Why are all the healers in Canada?
That's a little bit of it.
Well, I feel like you might know.
I have no idea. But
it's true. That's
something I'm noticing. I'm like,
we're not that much
healers in Canada.
Maybe there's more rural. I don't know. Maybe
more connection to nature, I suppose. Depending on where you're at.
In British Columbia, where there's huge access to beautiful, oceans and islands and trees and forests and mountains and lakes, and not a huge population. So there is I guess that's a huge difference between the US and Canada's population. So maybe that's a factor. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that might be part of it.
Interesting hypothesis. Yes.
So I'm curious
I'm
because
fascinated.
You touched a little bit on, you said PTSD, and I know, EMDR has gotten a lot of kind of steam and gained a lot of popularity in the last few years. And I've seen it do wondrous things with a lot of people. And then I know we haven't talked about this yet, but you also, you mentioned that you started working with psychedelics kind of briefly, but I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you're bringing it into kind of what you're doing now, because I know you've been kind of dabbling more, right? And we'll talk about the kind of company that you've been working with, but how do you see psychedelics kind of playing into therapeutic practices? It's really a hot topic right now. And I'm glad that it is. I mean, I'm glad that it's really getting kind of the recognition, but also like the credibility, I think that it deserves. And I'm curious to know kind of like where you stand on it, what you've seen, how you've integrated it, all the things.
Yeah. It's a fascinating field. Because there's so many applications, and there's all these medicines that, once you start getting into it, you start realizing like, oh my gosh, there's magic mushrooms, and there's ketamine, and there's LSD, and there's psychedelic cactuses, and there's and pathogens like MDMA, and there's and they all have very specific application. They're really good at certain things. Say like ketamine, for example. It's has a dissociative quality to it, which can be really helpful for working with dissociation. So in trauma, often a part of someone will split off and dissociate, right? Because what's happening is just way too much for their system to handle. And so it takes off, and because trauma is like a loop stuck in time, that gets stuck in your body somewhere. If you didn't dissociate from that, you'd be, say, experiencing chronic anxiety.
Right.
So, which is horrible. Some people do experience that, but some people, their body has the intelligence to dissociate from that spot in their body, and therefore they're not just re-experiencing the trauma all the time. And in shamanism, they would do what they call like a soul retrieval, where the shaman would find you that dissociated part of you and bring it back into your body. But I used to do that for years, but I found actually more effective is to actually get people to consciously dissociate. Like, where do you go when you dissociate? Like, oh, I'm feeling kind of space. Okay, just go with it and bring your awareness. Oh, I'm in. And usually it's like some spirit world, like a cave in the spirit world, or they're in like they're in nowhere, they're in limbo, they're in like, there's just nothing here.
Yeah.
And then what I do is give their body a lot of touch and get them to like bring their own soul part or psyche part back. And as it comes towards the body, the trauma starts to process, right? The reason it left starts to come up, and then you have to process the fear and the panic and the anxiety and then all these layers of shame that come up with that. Biological shame. There's this, one of the things that isn't talked about anywhere. Even Brené Brown, who's supposed to be an expert on shame, doesn't talk about biological shame. It's the mechanism that the parasympathetic part of our nervous system uses to suppress things, like the actual biological suppression of unprocessed trauma and unprocessed emotional charge. It uses biological shame, and you guys will see this in your practice all the time, these shame layers that people always make a story out of it, like, oh, it's because I'm a loser and I'm not good enough, and it's because I'll never amount, whatever. Some story about, it's actually just old biological shame, like off-gassing, and the mind's trying to make sense of it. But so with ketamine, you can actually, it helps with that conscious dissociation, and then the reintegration, and also gives you a bit of distance from the trauma, so you can kind of like go into it more gently without getting sucked into like the core of re-experiencing it and freaking out. So it gives you a bit more ability to kind of titrate and dip into the trauma and come out, and because you actually are a little bit dissociated, but you can really work with that. So there's just one medicine, one application, but there's all these other medicines that have other applications. So that it's a whole field that I'm really glad is gaining credibility, because it can accelerate the healing path.
I imagine Tim Leary and Ram Dass are being like, you sons of bitches, we've been saying this shit.
Yes, yeah.
Since the 60s, totally. They're like turning over in their graves. I hope they're happy about it. But yeah, I mean, I'm just so excited that it's finally starting to hit the mainstream. But so the company that you have been working with, this company Nectara, I think what I want to talk to and just give our listeners a little insight into is this idea about what would you call them? Guides? Like this idea of guides. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think what I have heard from people who are apprehensive or a little like not sure about the whole psychedelic thing when it comes to psychotherapy and just psyche healing is this, they feel like, this is actually like probably a quote from somebody. It's like, oh, it's just a bunch of people who get together in the desert and they do drugs. And it's like, well, that's not actually what it is. And there's a difference between that and what we are talking about, which is using psychedelics for healing. So I guess, what are your thoughts, I suppose, on the point of a guide? What makes a guide? What is the purpose of a guide?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's such a huge spectrum, right? Everything from like, I just want to get fucked up and not have to feel my pain, all the way to we're using these medicines very strategically in a hyper safe environment with all the variables considered and aftercare. And, you can do it in a really, like, what I found is the safer and more balmer the container is, the deeper people can go. So, especially I do a lot of like early infant trauma work, which not many people are working with, which is actually where personality disorders come from. I have a whole different perspective on I call them perceptual distortions, because it affects the way people perceive things. And all of those it's actually a form of brain damage from trauma under age 1, like actually being like shaken baby and stuff like that can lead to narcissistic personality disorder. Anyways, there's a whole field we could talk about there. But a guide, again, there's a whole spectrum, right? There's different applications for these medicines. So sometimes people just want to do like a high dose psilocybin mushroom experience, and maybe they're low trauma and they want to have a spiritual experience or a mystical experience, and they take a high dose and they wear eye shades and they've got headphones on. And basically, mostly what you could do that with what they would call a sitter. So a sitter is just someone that's maybe a little bit familiar with, say, they've done a bunch themselves, and they're a friend of yours or something, and they know that you're not like trauma heavy, and you can have a mystical experience, and they're just there to help you to the bathroom and make sure that
drinking water,
or bring you water and maybe process a little bit as you're coming out of it and write stuff down, and right. So that would be a sitter. But I mean, all sitters should be trained in some form of like, what do you do if someone has a panic attack? Because that's when things go sideways and you end up with ambulances and police, and what is when somebody freaks out and the sitter doesn't know what to do. So in my courses, I'm teaching people, this is how you regulate a panic attack. This is what you do if someone's going into psychosis. This is so you're
actually training guides. That's part of what you're teaching.
I'm training guides. My course is an introduction. It's called the Somatic Psychedelic Therapist Training. So I'm bringing somatic therapy. In the training that I do, we only use one medicine. And it's an empathogen very similar to MDMA called 3-MMC. And so the full title of the course is working with empathogens for trauma resolution and relational repair. So I'm teaching guides how to hold it. And then if people, I do kind of an apprentice style training with people that goes on past the initial 12 days. And that's one brilliant thing about the MAP study is this co-therapy model is not only fabulous for like working with people with PTSD, but it's fabulous for teaching, because you can have one of the co-therapists that's an expert, has been doing this for years and years, and someone that's new, and you can actually work on somebody together. And then that new person, the student, learns by actually doing it. I mean, this is when I was interested in all this stuff, and I was going to I thought, I'll go to school and I'll, and it was like 95% like academic and like 5% like 95% theory. Like, here's the theory of how to sit with people, and then 5% of the time we'll actually sit with people. And for me, it should be the other way around. 95% doing it, totally. 5% theory of like the background and the understanding of it, So I have a very experiential way of teaching. Like, we actually sit with people a lot, and and the co-therapy is fabulous, because you can do a 7-hour session with somebody, and that the student gets 7 hours of like practice just by doing it, which is, we tend to learn way more quickly that way. And embody the teachings. It's not just a theory. It's like, oh, this is how, you can actually feel what to do, because there's a transmission that you've imbibed.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, that's how supervision should be, but I don't think that's really what happens all the time. Unless you're like Danae, who has a lovely supervisor and got very lucky. But I think for a lot of us going through the clinical process, that's not really what it was.
Right. Yeah. So I think, like, as far as there's a lot of talk in the field about integration too, because the other thing, these medicines can kind of really blow you, you open up your stuff and uncontain your previously nicely packaged suppression system, and all of a sudden your suppression's gone, and it can go on for days or weeks after the session where you're destabilized. So there's a whole field emerging that they would call integration coaches, that like, hey, I'm still destabilized after my ceremony, and the practitioner is on to the next one, and not available, and what do I do? So Nectara is this organization that I've teamed up with, and they offer like online integration coaching, and they're very high integrity. They vet their coaches. Like they don't just let anybody sign on, because it's a bit of a wild west out there in the psychedelic therapy field. You know, soon MDMA is going to be legal for PTSD, and ketamine therapy is really big because it's already legal. But then there's all these people that are sort of springing up that's like, oh, I've done acid a few times, like I could sit for people.
I could do that.
yeah, you know, but they've never really done any of their own inner work. And so, you know, for people out there that are interested in it, I would really ask around, because the reputation of the person that you're working with is, and ask more than one person. And because when you're, the beauty of psychedelic medicines is they make your brain more neuroplastic. So what you do when you're on them has a much deeper impact. So likewise, if something bad happens when you're on them, it has a bigger impact. You know, that's why if you have a bad trip, it's worse when you're on.
I remember mine from college and high school.
Because it has more, it's more impactful than if you're just in a regular state, you had a bad experience or whatever. So, you know, the setting, the container that you set up is so important. And especially if you have aftercare, like somebody that can take them after the session and put them to bed. And you know, I realized therapy is actually way more to do with parenting than psychology. Psychology is like a symptom of like not getting those needs met as a kid, you know, and all the neuroses that happen as a result
from that.
Yeah, Sasha, I'm just really grateful to have you on having this conversation, because I feel like I've been equal parts excited about psychedelic therapy, and also a little bit what I have seen is some of what you're speaking to, where there hasn't been a container that really holds space for proper integration, and some deep destabilization that I've seen in clients, where something that was sort of stabilized in terms of some pretty significant trauma, and either I've read a book on like why this is effective and I've decided to go out in the woods and do it by myself, or, you know, like you said, I'm going to take my homeboy with me and a couple buddies, and really have put myself in a position where something that I was functioning, I am no longer sort of functioning around. And I think it's just really important, one, to understand like the aftermath of what some of that can be. And also I love that Nectara is, you know, a space that people can look into that is providing that type of a safe container, because it's really, really important. I think if we're going to utilize what I think is amazing to have at our disposal, like in a really conscious way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have a friend who, I mean, look, we all have our traumas. And so I don't know all of his traumas, but I have a friend who just started doing it kind of on his own recreation, wanted to have the spiritual experience, right? Wasn't necessarily doing it for the kind of traumatic undercovering, all that kind of stuff. And this was years ago, really before this became a little bit more mainstream. And I'll tell you, he is not the same person he was before he did it. And I don't say that in the best way. He became very detached from reality after that experience. And I don't think he ever really came back down to earth. I don't think he had the proper integration after the fact. I think he did it in an environment that felt contained at the time, but I don't think there was the integration after. And I think in that moment, it was almost like there was a window, and he didn't have the window kind of properly. Nobody came through that window, right? And so the window closed, and now he's just a different person, and he functions. I mean, we're not talking about somebody who's totally not functioning anymore, but I don't know, he's different and emotionally a lot more vacant, I think, than he was prior. And so I'm with Zane. It's like, I love this, and I'm also like a little scared of where it could go if we're not doing it right.
Yes. Yeah. I agree 100%. It has potential for great healing and great good, and also potential for harm. So, I mean, for me, luckily, I'd been a therapist for, 20 years before I added that in.
Right.
So I kind of had an understanding, and then added it in very slowly with friends and family, and really it took me a while to figure out, you need to I won't just do a session, like a medicine session with somebody, unless I've already worked with them for a while and I've got a good sense of what they're, and there's certain contraindications. You really want to screen people if they've got, schizophrenia potentially. You can't, there's certain, you don't want to, it's not for everybody. Yeah. And if you're in a really unstable, living environment, it's not the best idea to go and do, because the psychedelics in general, they help to disintegrate things, which is good because most of us are really locked in, and stuck in our patterns. So they can really help unstick things that have been stuck our whole life. But yeah, if you're not ready for what gets unstuck, then you can end up in challenging situations. So it's really important.
Meanwhile, the native populations around the world that have been doing this with reverence and containment for, eons at this point are kind of like laughing at our way of fumbling into this and being like, these people just going out in the woods and just doing it without any kind of container, right?
Exactly. And the way that they do it, they've got built-in integration because you do it in a circle, and then
it's sacred and it's
Still
communal.
there, you go back into the tribe, and how was your journey? Oh, it was great. I'm feeling a little scared. Oh, here, you don't have to be, work at the office on Monday morning. And spirit world's opened up.
Right.
And
you're underneath these like fluorescent lights on your computer, like what is happening?
Exactly.
No, absolutely.
So they're the way, just their lifestyle kind of has a natural social integration built into it, so they don't need as much of an elaborate setup afterwards for the container if you live in that kind of setting. They've done it successfully for thousands of years, and it's been really helpful to those cultures and inspired a lot of art and visionary work and deep healing.
Yeah, this is exciting. Well, Sasha, we have a series of questions that we ask all of our guests that we'd love to get into with you if we can.
Some rapid fire.
So the first question is, who have been your greatest teachers, inspirations, people that have impacted you along your journey, whether they're people you know or just people that you really respect their work?
Okay. Well, definitely my children would probably be the biggest teachers. And, I read a lot of parenting books when I started having kids because I thought it'd be good to kind of have some idea of what I was doing. And looking back, a lot of them were crap. Like,
my God, parents are got the truth.
Yeah.
Right.
But there was one good one. It's called Hold On to Your Kids by Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld.
Can that man do any wrong?
What's that?
I was like, can he do any wrong? I love him.
Yeah. He hones in on. He's a good emissary for understanding like that where all this stuff is coming from. Gordon Neufeld was more the expert in that one. I want to give him full credit because he's awesome. But it's all about attachment parenting. It's called Hold On to Your Kids, and if you look at other primates or what, they're always being held until they're about one or something, so the whole cry it out method was a disaster. Half of my work that I do is trying to undo that nonsense. And so parenting was definitely a big influence, and some of those attachment parenting, Gabor's and Gordon Neufeld. On a spiritual level, I would say Adyashanti was my biggest influence there. Probably the most clear of any spiritual teacher that I was able to find. Mariah Moser, who taught the Relational Somatic Therapy.
Yeah, I want to look into that.
Opening to Grace is her website. She is just a gem of a human being. My dad has been a really good influence on me. I'm really like my grandfather went to war and was in boarding school and raped all through boarding school and was just a poor guy, PTSD. Back in those days, we didn't have psychedelics and men's groups and therapists and all that. So they were just stuck with all their unprocessed trauma. And then of course it affected their behavior and their ability to love and all. So somehow he managed to be a good dad in spite of not really getting much from his father. So I'm really grateful to him.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
That's lovely. And that's
those
something
are the tops. What's that?
I said it's lovely. It's also something you don't always hear a lot about. So I love that you gave that shout out to your dad.
Yeah, thanks.
He
did psychedelics, actually. I think helped in his 20s. He was 1969, he was 20 or something.
Peak time. I love it.
And he said that really helped him. And then he went to like parenting class. Like he really tried to like explore this question of what is a good man and what is a good father. The other,
it makes sense that you're a seeker, by the way.
I guess, yeah, it kind of set me up for that to some degree. The other shout out, probably the most valuable resource that I've found just recently in the last couple of years is my men's group. I'm in 2 different men's groups, one like an hour away and one in my town that I started. And if any men listening to this, if you can find a men's group, do it. Because our role models don't know, like, greedy politicians and hockey players are not necessarily good role models. We actually, like in the men's group work, we're exploring this question: what is a good man and what is a good father? And we're kind of trying to crowdsource from each other what that looks like, because there's not a lot of examples out there. So we're having to like discover it together. And it like when I hurt my back, they came and stacked my firewood, and like I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now without that support. And it's that's been a huge mentorship for me is that group.
For saying that.
Yeah. I just want to jump in and say, if you're a man and you're a space holder, start a men's group, because I feel like there is just not enough. Like I'm constantly looking for resources for the men that I work with. Men are so hungry to connect in this way. So if you have that ability, please start a men's group, because it's so important, and you're so right.
Thank you. That's a brilliant idea. Yeah. And even if you don't know what you're doing, just the fact that you're exploring
calling people together
is going to help.
Absolutely.
Then you're not alone, at least.
And you can reach out to Sasha or look into his work for some guidance.
Well, actually, my favorite thing that I've been doing lately is working with other men's groups with medicine. So we'll do a weekend, and we'll do a whole pre-day, and then a medicine day, and then an integration day.
I love this.
And it's also a beautiful way of kind of teaching the men how to hold space for each other, because they get about an hour and a half or 2 hours in the middle, and you got 6 guys holding space, and you can go into some super deep, because you got 6 nervous systems so people have been processing their circumcision trauma and their birth trauma and stuff that's really hard to do with just one person. So there's the group work it's a fascinating field of like, whoa, you can go deeper because there's more holding, and it's fascinating. And then the medicine also. And
then you send them back into their communities with this newfound ability to be able to hold space, even if they're not like a quote unquote therapist or whatever. I mean, just having the ability to hold space for your friend or your partner or your child in a way that you didn't know how to before, couldn't access before, can have such profound impacts, not only in those relationships, but it trickles down from there.
Absolutely. And I've been surprised at how fast they've learned, like one ceremony, and they're getting, we do a couple ceremonies, they're really getting it, and it changes your life. You can actually be available to other people, and be, one of the things I say is like, don't say much, just be there with your caring heart. That's what matters.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay. So the second question is, what do you do, or where do you find yourself in a state of flow? So what's that thing that you're doing when you're like, I blink my eyes and the whole day is gone?
Okay. Well, the medicine work actually is an 8-hour day can go by. It feels like that. So I'm definitely in the flow when I'm doing that work. Also, I've been, when I take my kids hiking, that's another one. We're just in a flow, and we're picking huckleberries and whatever. And but I've also been getting into this flow of writing lately, and just I found sort of the more I've done all this trauma resolution work on myself, and this is the other big message is the most important thing is to keep doing your own work. Beyond 100%. Whatever courses you take or knowledge you have, just keep doing your own work. That's number one. So as I've been doing my own work, I've noticed like my ability to well, a few things. One, feel. Like when the more embodied I've become, the more I can feel, which means the more I can feel other people and what's going on for them. But there's also been this ability to like pull information out of the ethers. Some people might call it like channeling or something. I guess all artists talk
to, like,
about
source.
when you're, yeah, exactly. Like most artists say their best work comes when they're kind of out of the way. And it's the same with the healing arts. You know, I'm getting much better at getting out of the way and allowing that deeper intelligence to run the show. And
That's right.
It feels really good.
Yeah, love it. And what breaks your heart, Sasha?
Oh, there's a lot of things. That's a really good question. Thank you. One of the things that breaks my heart is seeing how shut down humans are, because when we're not shut down, we're these exquisitely sensitive, kind, loving beings. And when we're stuck in our unprocessed trauma and then therefore having to shut it all down with this biological shame, and then we can't feel anything, so we just become thinking machines, and then our children don't feel loved because our parents are frozen, or they're dissociated, or they're not there, or they don't have the relational intelligence or the emotional intelligence to show up for themselves, let alone someone else. Right. So that breaks my heart, that there's all these kids out there that are just longing to be held and longing for connection and longing for love, and then the parents are either too stressed or too survival mode or too traumatized to even if they want to give it, they're blocked. And so that's heartbreaking. Yeah, I find all this division with COVID heartbreaking. You know, and I really want to like, there's a really cool group in Castle called Beyond the Divide, you know, where it doesn't matter what your beliefs are, we're all humans on the same team, and can we learn to tolerate and accept and love each other regardless of our viewpoints, because this associating people with their viewpoints, like, and not being able to be friends because we disagree on, even if they're really important, you know, it's heartbreaking that like it's wrecking families, and it's wrecking friendships, and it's wrecking society. And we really need to overcome that division. But I've been really feeling that division with passports and all this nonsense, and it really it's painful. You know, so that breaks my heart. And I also, you know, when I see clear cuts and this, like, just the greed that's, you know, having a huge impact on the earth. They still want to cut old growth forests, and, you know, these cathedrals of vibrational medicine that, you know, people just going there, you could heal a whole bunch of stuff, and they want to cut it down for greed. You know, that's heartbreaking too.
Did you read sidebar is it the Overstory? Did you read that book yet?
No. What's it called?
I think it's called The Overstory. I'll put it in the notes if I find it. I have it actually on my, I'm really bad at remembering like who wrote what and names of things, but it's a book it's a fiction book, but it is basically that. It's all about like these old forests and what they do and the intelligence of these forests. And there's 4 different storylines. I'm telling this for the listeners too, because y'all, this was the first fiction book I read post grad school, because we all know that who reads anything in grad school, they're not supposed to read. Right. And it rocked my world. Like I still to this day, years later, I just look at trees differently than I did before reading this book. And it's a deeply moving book. So I suggest it if you haven't read it yet. And then the final question is, it's a very serious question. It is, what is your favorite food?
I would say sushi is my favorite food.
Oh. We get very excited about hearing.
We do. Yeah. It's always different. It's always like
a little delight every time. We're like, ooh. My favorite food is cinnamon rolls, and
cinnamon rolls.
Basically, any dessert, because that's just who I eat. Sugar.
Mine is macaroni and cheese. I've said it before. I'll say it again. I would bathe in it if it was socially acceptable.
Right on. Thank you
Yes.
for disclosing.
Well, Sasha, you are just an exquisite gift. I'm so excited to meet you. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. I'm just so moved listening to you speak. And I'm always so moved by men that are supporting other men. I don't know why. It just like rips into my soul and just like makes me feel really hopeful for our future. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us. How can our listeners get in touch with you, follow you, that type of thing, if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah. The best way would be to go to nectara.co, and hopefully you guys can put the link, in the show notes or whatever.
Yeah.
They've starting in, I think it's December, they're launching their online community platform. So it's a place you can go if you need it, if you're looking for integration, but it's also a place to go just to be in circles. So it's a virtual online circle where you can start to share different things. There's a part of that online platform that I'm heading called the Trauma Resolution Network. And I'm going to be on there every month doing Q&A. And that's more for therapists that want to learn this information, because about 2/3 of what I'm teaching and what I talk about I've also just done a masterclass. Nectara funded me to record this masterclass. So it's part of the Trauma Resolution Network. And there's sort of you can watch that. And if you feel really stoked and intrigued, then you can join the network. And I'm constantly going to be putting new content out on there and doing these Q&As. And then, if you're really stoked, you can take the psychedelic therapist training and then apprentice. And, there's a whole path, because I really want to, because I was looking for 25 years of like, what's the root? And a lot of what I'm teaching on there, probably 2/3, is not in any textbooks. It's not even Gabor's experts that he had on the wisdom of trauma, and they did all those. They didn't mention biological shame, and yet it's something that you need if you're really sincere about working with this stuff, that you need to know, because it comes up layer after layer after layer after layer. And if you're not processing it, it's a block to healing, because it just freezes it out. And most people don't even realize that they're in a shame. I call it a shame freeze, where it's suppressing what the emotional energy or the trauma energy, but because they've been doing that for 50 years or whatever, they don't even know. And that's where you'd want to go and like break it up and get it moving. And so anyways, there's a whole bunch of it's going to be a really cool network. There's people doing breath work on there. There's integration coaches that you can hook up with if you want to work with them on a ongoing basis. And my vision for the world is that we train an army of trauma resolution therapists, so that they can work in places like police stations and ambulance places, and so that as these first responders are fire halls, and they're seeing all this, they're accumulating all this vicarious trauma, and no one's talking about it, and then they have to quit because they've got PTSD, because it's accumulated to a point where their system can't handle it anymore. But if you had like a weekly meeting with your trauma resolution therapist, you could process all that vicarious trauma that you've seen, that scraping people off the road or whatever you're doing, and then you're not going to end up with PTSD. So I really want to, part of the foundation of this network that we're launching is to reinvent healthcare and reinvent mental health, and really shift the understanding, because a lot of mental health is just sort of putting names on trauma symptoms.
Band-aids on bullet holes, I like to call it.
Yes, band-aids on bullet holes. And once you see that, oh, these are just trauma symptoms, bipolar is just, anxious nervous energy is manic, and depression is the biological parasympathetic shame trying to shut down that, and you oscillate between them. It doesn't matter what name you start to understand. Oh, these are just symptoms of unprocessed trauma. They're not actually disorders.
Totally.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. And the Canadians shall heal us, y'all.
Let's look to the Canadians.
Oh, we need to work together. Yeah.
To save the world.
That's it. Wow.
Amazing. Well, Sasha, we'll definitely, I could have this conversation with you for hours. There's so much more that I want to talk to you about. So
Yes.
maybe if you're cool with it, we'll ping you and have you on for a follow-up.
I would love to. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about like developmental trauma and attachment.
Would love it.
trauma
Let's
and
get
kind of
into it,
into
please.
the
Yeah,
nuances of the
you're
nervous
definitely going to be a two-parter.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And if people are interested, if you check out the masterclass, it's got way more in depth on all this stuff.
Cool.
So yeah.
I might do that myself.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
Love it.
Lovely
Thank you
to
so much,
connect with you
Sasha.
guys. Thank you so much for having me. What a treat to meet you guys and geek out on all this awesome stuff.
Geeking out is the name of our game.
Yeah. Right on.
Okay. Thank you,
All right.
Sasha.
Take care.